Hello, my dear friends. You're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of May of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev because today Zelensky made very interesting statement. According to him, if Putin does not come to Turkey, it will look like his complete defeat. But we know for sure that the president of the Russian Federation is not going to do this. Telling the truth, all these attempts from the Western countries to force the president of Russia to go to Turkey, as for me, looked like a trap. Anyway, let's continue. We have very interesting statement from Russia. The topics at the Istanbul talks will cover issues of sustainable settlement and realities on the ground, including the issue of territories. This is very important statement because now the Russians are trying to tell us that they realize that sooner or later the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine will be signed. And according to this statement, we believe that the Russians during the next several months or weeks will try to take as many as possible territories because they understand everything that they are able to take under complete control right now will never go back to Ukraine. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction where the Russians continue their offensive. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the area of the settlement by the name of Zelene Polye. This information was confirmed and provided by neutral mappers and by pro-Ukrainian sources. The situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians, but as you can see, the Russians are not trying to attack both villages at the same time. As for now, if you take a look at this map, you're going to see that there are lots of trenches, fortifications, anti-tank ditches, and different trenches around the settlement that slow down the Russians. Now, most likely, the Russians are focused in this area trying to improve their positions using engineering methods. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction. During the previous several days, we've been receiving lots of updates from this area. The Russians continue their offensive operation, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. According to information we have, the Russians managed to take under control and to secure the northeastern part, and the Russians managed to establish complete control over the southwestern part of the settlement. So this is the situation on the ground. The most interesting thing is that the Russians managed to take under control this part of the settlement. Basically, the Ukrainians lost one of two supply roads that they used to have to support their forces in Bogatyr. I'll remind you that during the previous days, the Ukrainians had possibilities to support their forces in the settlement of Bogatyr from the northeast, and the Ukrainians were using N15 road for the same purposes. But now we see that both roads were taken by the Russians, and the Ukrainians currently have lots of problems. As for now, the Ukrainians concentrated their forces in the most northwestern part of the settlement, and this part of the village of Bogatyr is under very heavy fire. The Russians are bombing and attacking this territory with all type of calibers they have. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainians, if they decide to fall back, they will have to use fields to move in the western direction. But when talking about this territory, the Ukrainians will face lots of problems. Lots of engineering equipment, lots of different barriers were established by the Ukrainians, and now if they decide to fall back, they will be forced to handle with their own engineering, let's say, barriers they managed to establish during the previous days. So we expect that if Ukrainians decide to fall back, they will suffer huge losses. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Alexeyevka. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for the eastern outskirts. Furthermore, the Russians continue their attempts to semi-encircle the village of Alexeyevka, to outflank the settlement and to attack the village from behind. But the Russians have also lots of problems. Once again, the Russians have lots of lines in front of them, lots of engineering traps, barriers were established, so that is why now the Russians are forced to spend lots of time to walk through these territories. When talking about the Dnipro direction or the Novopavlovka direction, we haven't received during the previous 24 hours anything, and now it's become clear why the Russians stopped. The thing is that right in front of the Russians, right along the border, the Ukrainians, as you can see, established two lines of defense. The Ukrainians established a line of dragon teeth, and the Ukrainians established a line of anti-tank ditches beaches. So if the Russians decide to continue, they will have lots of problems, and the Russians most likely will be able to continue offensive operation just with infantry. But it's too dangerous, because if the Russians continue moving with infantry can be discovered and destroyed by Ukrainian FPV drones. So we believe that most likely the Russians are not going to continue offensive operation further this way. Most likely the Russians will continue, and they will try to attack the settlement of Novopavlovka from the southwest using this line, and most likely the Russians will continue offensive operation in the Dnipro direction using this line of attacks. Because when talking about these settlements, here the Russians have more chances to get additional results and better success. As for this area, during the previous 24 hours, several sources reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to get the outskirts of the settlement of Moravka and the settlement of Mykhailivka. But when talking about this territory, there is another Dragon Teeth line, which is obviously a huge barrier for the Russians, but most likely to attack in this direction is much more easier for the Russians than to attack in the direction of Novopavlovka through these fields. Now let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, Ukrainian sources published several videos where we can see the status and the situation in the city itself. In this video, we can see how Ukrainian soldier was moving through the ruins of the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians bombed this part of the city too many times since the beginning of the battle for the settlement. At the same time, the Russians are not trying to attack this area because they understand that there are still lots of buildings, lots of positions that can be used by the Ukrainians as defense barrier. So the Russians, that is why, decided to outflank the city of Pokrovsk and to defeat the Ukrainians on the flanks. And probably the first defeat Ukrainians got on the eastern flank of the city of Pokrovsk, because during the previous 24 hours we got lots of updates exactly from this area. So let's discuss them in details. And first, let's talk about the settlement of Mykhailivka. According to information we have, during the previous day, the Russians managed to take under complete control the settlement of Mykhailivka, and this information was confirmed by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. And based on this report that we got yesterday, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. Furthermore, according to information we have today, by the end of the 14th of May of 2025, the Russians managed to take under complete control the next village to Mykhailivka, the settlement of Mykhailivka. So once again, during the previous 48 hours, the Russians managed to take under complete control all these territories. Obviously, this is very powerful progress of the Russians. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to take under complete control this stronghold to the north of the settlement of Grodovka. This probably progress on the ground allowed the Russians to create a very powerful flank in this area, and now the Russians can feel free to move further in the northern direction with the purpose to take under complete control this pocket. Now let's talk about this pocket in details. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to defeat the Ukrainians completely, and we see, according to these changes, Ukrainian lines collapsed completely. Let's discuss in details. First of all, in the evening of the 30th of May of 2025, the Russian sources published this video. In this video, we can see several episodes from the settlement of Malynivka where the Russians were raising their flags. And based on this report, we have adjusted the map, mainly the eastern and the central part of the settlement of Malynivka. Later, we got another video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians with FPV drones on the territory of the western part of Malynivka. Lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking the Russians with drones, with cluster munitions, and many other types of weapons were involved in this process. And in this very moment, we can see several Russian soldiers that were moving along some building in this area. This building was immediately geolocated, and this episode that you can see right now in front of your screens took place exactly in this area. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and we have colored additional territories under complete Russian control. So now we see that the Russians, during the previous, maybe not 24, but probably 48 hours, managed to improve their positions in this area, and now we see that most likely the next target for the armored force of the Russian Federation is to take under complete control this dense network of the fortifications that are located right in central part of this area. So this complex is the next target of the armored force of the Russian Federation, and most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time, because there are very high risks that Ukrainians can be encircled and taken by the Russians in pincers, or caught by the Russians in cauldrons. So that is why we expect that during the next maybe 72 hours, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this area further in the northwestern directions, in the direction of the settlement of Nova Ekonomichna. So this is the situation. Another important thing, that pro-Ukrainian sources also adjusted their maps in this area. They shown partial control over the settlement of Malynivka, and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians made several attempts to attack in the northern direction with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Novopoltavka. So according to pro-Ukrainian sources, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to answer this territory as well. This is very important, because now we see that Ukrainians have huge problems on the area of Novopoltavka, and if the Russians continue, then most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the northern directions towards Popoy Yar. Otherwise, the Ukrainians would be caught in cauldron. So we see that the Ukrainian lines in this area are crumbling right in front of our eyes. Another important progress is coming from this pocket. As you can see, we have changes on the ground. So let's take a look at them and let's discuss them in details. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, the Russians managed to take under complete control several strongholds. So this is the first stronghold that was taken completely by the Russians, and we have video that confirm this. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians from the 36th Brigade were attacking Russians in this area with FPV drones. There are lots of episodes, and one of the episodes was geolocated. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Furthermore, when talking about the northern part, we have another video, and here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in the most northern part of the settlement of Malynivka on the territory of this company's stronghold. So which means that the Russians have already begun assault of this dense network of fortifications. So we see that the Russians are about to take this territory under complete control. But when talking about this pocket and Russian positions in the vicinity of Malynivka, we don't see that the Russians are planning to move further. They're planning, obviously, to move further in the northeastern direction towards the city of Konstantinovka, but the Russians will face huge problems. First of all, if you take a look at this map, you're going to see red lines. So all these red lines show us the anti-tank ditches. So it's going to be very difficult for the Russians to cross these anti-tank fortifications. Furthermore, when talking about these blue lines, these lines show us the Dragon Teeth, and also, as you can see, there are lots of strongholds. So when talking about this area, if the Russians decide to move further in the northern direction or the northeastern direction, they will face lots of problems. So that is why we believe that the Russians are not going to use these roads of attack right now. Most likely they're going to have to make several preparations and several probably adjustments, and they will be forced to waste lots of time until they're able to improve their positions there. But we believe that the Russians will continue their offensive operation inside of the Kliban-Byksky pocket. And during the previous 24 hours, as you can see, according to the map, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. So let's discuss the situation details. But first of all, before we start discussing the situation, you see that in the area where the Russians are trying to advance, we're talking about these fields, there are almost no trenches or fortifications. So I don't know why, but the Ukrainians since the beginning of 2014 or since the beginning of the special military operation haven't invested even a single dollar to create more or less reliable trenches, strongholds, Dragon Teeth or anti-tank ditches in this area, and now the Ukrainians are paying significant price for this. So let's discuss this video, and in this video we can see how Russians were attacking this complex network of fortifications on motorcycles. The Russians were attacking this territory under very heavy of the armored force fire of the armored force of Ukraine, and in this very moment we can see Russian motorcycle that entered this area and landed infantry. This episode took place exactly in this area, which means that the Russians managed to get this territory without any problems and without any barriers. And we are not surprised, because if you take a look at this map, you see no trenches, no fortifications, no anti-tank ditches, no Dragon Teeth, nothing. The Russians have no problems to advance deep inside of this pocket from the western direction, and this is exactly what the Russians are doing right now. So we see that Ukrainian positions are collapsing in this area, and most likely due to this video and due to this first geolocation that shows Russian progress on the ground, we see that Ukrainian lines in this area are going to collapse very soon. When talking about the eastern flank during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special, just regular videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking. And telling the truth, we don't expect any offensive operation or huge or major offensive operation in this area, because most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the northern direction along N20 road due to huge problems from the west. Because even when talking about Alexandra Kalinova, there is just one anti-tank ditches in this area that can slow down or to stop the Russians, but obviously this is not something that will stop the Russians completely. So the Kliban-Byksky pocket is collapsing. Currently it's very difficult to say when exactly the pocket would collapse completely, but obviously this is going to happen very soon. When talking about the Italy's direction, there are very heavy clashes and the Russians continue offensive operation as well. Once again, the Russians understand that sooner or later the peace agreement would be signed with the Ukrainians, so that is why as many as territories they take, they will take them probably for a very long period of time, and the Ukrainians most likely using force will not be able to restore control over them. As for the previous 24 hours, as you can see, the Russians managed to improve their positions around the southern Malynivka. So this territory was taken by the Russians. We have geolocation that confirm this, and we have these adjustments on map based on neutral mappers. So the Russians are about to begin fighting for the South Malynivka railway station. Furthermore, we have adjusted this small pocket. If you remember, the Russians months ago attacked Lipovka and took the village under complete control, but later we got several videos that were published by the 100th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, where they were counter-attacking the Russians in the city of Terezk using these roads of attack. So we came to a conclusion that most likely the village of Lipovka was recaptured by the Ukrainians, and the Russians most likely were forced to fall back from that territory due to high risk of being encircled, and the Russians just decided to maintain the lines and to shorten them. Now let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar. We have lots of updates. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to secure the central part completely, and we have a proof. In this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the city of Chasiv Yar from many directions, and how Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians with artillery fire and FPV drone strikes. But Ukrainians' attempts didn't stop the Russians, and the Russians managed to improve their positions. In this very moment we can see how Ukrainians were attacking the citadel of the city of Chasiv Yar. And based on this video we have adjusted the map and we have colored this part in Russian favor. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions in fields. Now let's talk about the Sivas direction. During the previous 24 hours we got lots of important updates from the territory of the settlement of Tarskoe. Several pro-Russian resources reported that during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly, and that the Russians secured the central and the eastern part of the settlement. Probably just the south, less than 10% left for the Russians to finish the battle for this territory. At the same time, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the settlement of Zarechna, the only place where Ukrainians have additional reinforcements and reserves and FPV drone operators that could be used for the defense operation of Tarskoe. But we see that currently Ukrainians can't do anything with this. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions in the area of Kolodizy. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to take additional 3 lines to the north of the settlement, which means that the village of Kolodizy is already semi-encircled, and we expect during the next 48 hours the beginning of the battle for this area. As for the Ritkadub and this area, we haven't received anything that can give us additional details about the battle on the territory of the village. When talking about the central and the northern Kupiansk direction, nothing special, just regular activities. The Russians are bombing and attacking the settlement of Sinkova. Some sources reported that the Russians have plans to cross the river of Oskol and to attack the area, but as for now, nothing changes. When talking about the northern directions, we have several icons. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the city of Sumy, and according to several mappers, the Russians improved their positions in the area of Belovody. So we are waiting for additional details to confirm this information. So the Russians, as you can see, entered the stage of major offensive operation. The Russians are advancing and Ukrainians have huge problems, especially in the Pokrovsk and in the Konstantinovka directions. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.